Welcome back to Insight. I'm here with Dave Farnbauch from Sweeney Law Firm. Today we're going to talk about informed consent for patients. So what does informed consent mean when patients are going into surgery? Is it that long form that we sign right before, the one that I don't necessarily read everything on, that I sign right before we go into surgery?
Yeah, I would say, Charity, that the typical patient thinks of informed consent is simply a long form with a lot of medical jargon and legal jargon that is presented to them right before surgery or shortly before they undergo some treatment that they're asked to sort of quickly peruse and sign. And people have this, I think, misconception that if they sign that form and then they have some of the complications that are on that form, that they are, they're precluding themselves from pursuing a legal case because they signed some informed consent form, and that's just not the case.
You do think that. You think, oh, I'm out of luck because I gave up my rights. So tell me about some situations where informed consent becomes an issue in legal cases.
Well, I think probably the best place to start, Charity, is just to explain what informed consent is, at least in Indiana, what the law requires. And in a nutshell, what the law requires is that the treating healthcare provider provide you with the important facts that a reasonable patient would want to know before you undergo treatment.
Okay.
I try to boil it down that way. What would a reasonable person, what would you want to know before you undergo treatment? So it really goes beyond just presenting you with a form. A doctor has to sit down and explain sort of the pros and cons and the risks to you to the point where you understand it, so that you can make an informed decision about whether you want to go forward with this particular mode of treatment or some other mode of treatment. So that's what informed consent is. Now, where it becomes sort of an issue in legal cases is where Dr. King and I see it come up the most is when a patient will undergo some treatment. Mostly the cases that we handle are complications from something that was done and how those complications were managed. And so when you undergo a procedure and things go wrong, and then obviously the task for the medical providers is to sort of get you back on track health-wise and respond to the complication or respond to the emergency, then that's where informed consent can really rear its ugly head, because a lot of times doctors get in a position where they should be referring you to another doctor to manage those complications. Or a lot of times a doctor will feel like, well, let's just give it more time and see how this plays out. And oftentimes, deciding to write it out and give it more time ends up being ultimately the wrong decision. Right. That you needed some emergency surgery to correct the problem. And so what the law requires is, if there is a complication and there is that kind of a situation, a doctor has to sit down and be candid with you. Here are our options. Maybe there's another doctor that's available that should be managing your care, and here are your options, so that patients can know the important facts and make decisions about how they want their care managed. So informed consent arises much more than people think in medical malpractice cases, and it has nothing to do with those forms that you sign. I'm not saying those forms that you sign have no significance, but most of the time, the focus in a medical malpractice case, if there's a claim for failure of a doctor to provide you with informed consent, those forms that you sign do not provide any sort of a defense for the healthcare provider.
And even though informed consent really is more verbal, it has to be documented, right?
Yeah.
In my chart. As a patient, it has to be documented in my chart.
Yeah, I mean, we see this all the time in medical malpractice cases where there's a claim of informed consent, where the doctor says, I told the patient this and I told the patient that. He goes into a lot of detail, 3 years later after the fact about what he told a patient. And the problem is, what we see Charity a lot is those conversations are not documented in the patient's chart. So a lot of times, a doctor or a healthcare provider can sort of provide a lot of cover for informed consent if they just document those conversations that they had with the patient in the chart so that we can see they actually did have those conversations.
Well, if you have questions about informed consent and in a medical issue you had or anything else like that, any questions about medical malpractice, all you have to do is give them a call at Sweeney Law Firm, 420-3137. They'll be glad to talk it through with you. We'll be right back.